In 7th grade, my friends and I went over to a friend's house to play with her mom's Ouija board that night. None of us had played with one before. Mary's mom was an extremely spiritual person who believed in energies, witchcraft, stuff like that. Before we used the board, Mary warned us that her mom would be really pissed if she found out that we were playing with it because Ouija boards can attract bad spirits into the home. With full knowledge of this, we decided to proceed anyway. This Ouija board was not like the average Ouija board you had ever seen. Along with the usual characteristics such as the alphabet, yes, no, goodbye, there was an entire array of symbols and signs that were all arranged in a circle. This was some seriously intricate stuff that we started just goofing around and communicating with random spirits here and there until we finally met one that had us in tears the entire sleepless night. First, we asked the spirit if it was a man or a woman, to which he replied man. Then we asked how he was killed, murder. That freaked us out only a little bit, but we were mostly excited. All of a sudden, before we even asked another question, the glass goes to the eyeball symbol, then spells out IN and goes to the water symbol. We didn't have a clue what that meant. It wasn't too scary until the spirit spelled out shower, and my best friend realized that the spirit was trying to get us to look into the shower. We froze. I've never been so scared in my entire life, especially sitting directly in front of the bathroom with the shower curtain all the way closed, faced in my direction. We all screamed and promised on our friendships that we had not moved it ourselves, very important promise. I felt like I was being watched and my friends thought so too. It was only 4 of us and I believe with all my heart that none of them had moved it because we were all too nervous to do anything. I'll never use a Ouija board again because of how crazy and intense that night was. I know I felt something in that room with us. I know it was something dangerous. Back in 2008, my girlfriend and I decided to go to an abandoned mental asylum off of Highway 82 in Alabama called Old Bryce. It shut down a few years back due to malpractice, and some of the ghost legends involve murder by staff at the facility. Essentially, this was a dumping ground for people that society didn't know what to do with. Thousands of people were sent there and died there. The facility consisted of 4 buildings: Bryce, the residence hall, SD Allen, the medical facility, the crematorium, and the guard shack. I have seen 2 ghosts in the residence hall, the bigger of the 2 I share with you now. My second visit to Old Bryce was strange. It was my first time inside the building, and I came prepared. It was me, my girlfriend, and our friend Chris. I had a flashlight and a DVD camcorder. Through the main entrance is a staircase on the right, which zigzags up to the 2nd floor, complete with anti-suicide fence at the top. Make a left, then another left, and then a quick right, and you are in the hall that led to the children's corridor. I had the flashlight in my left hand and camera in the right, scanning, trying to catch something. On the left at the entrance to that room, there was a bathroom with only a tub in it. I thought I saw something in the bathroom and shined the light that way, nothing. Moved the camera and light, thought I saw it again, and shined it back, nothing. Our night continued and finished without incident. The next day, I reviewed the footage. In that bathroom, I shined towards something I thought I saw, and I was right. When the light pans to the right, a bluish-white, illuminated little girl's face peers out from behind the door to follow the light. As the light shines back in her direction, over the course of 2 frames, she is half behind the door, next frame she was gone. My heart felt like an ice cube ran through it. I was in such shock. I proceeded to show everyone I knew. The girl's appearance was that of younger than 10, hair parted in the middle, unusually large forehead, and had some apparent deformation or disorder. I made the mistake of leaving the camera at a friend's house overnight, who apparently was not my friend, and he stole it. This is where it gets weirder. 2.5 years later, I was living in a different city. One of the legends of Old Bryce is that windows grow back, and if you do any damage to them, spirits will follow you home. I broke a window. I was laying in bed one night, about 3 to 4 a.m. I was on the verge of sleep, aware of where I was, and very comfortable. Out of nowhere, this immobilizing tingling sensation started at the tips of my toes. I was laying on my stomach with my arms under the pillow, completely helpless as this sensation crept its way slowly up my legs, midsection, and eventually entire body over the course of about 20 seconds. Once it covered me, I heard the whisper of a little girl, directly in my ear, say, "I'm in your room." I cringed tight and for some reason said aloud, "I love you." The feeling stopped and left me on the verge of tears. It may or may not have been that little girl from the asylum, but according to legend, it makes sense. I had an encounter with a black-eyed child when I worked at a hotel. That night was extremely slow. We only had 5 rooms occupied. I worked the night shift. I got there at 11 p.m., and I already felt an intense fear. This was pretty unusual as I was used to working there all alone during those hours 5 nights a week. I rarely saw people on my shift, so it's around 1 a.m., and I get even more freaked out. I look around the lobby and no one was there. I look at the cameras. There was one for literally everywhere in the hotel. I could see every inch of the grounds from the front desk. There wasn't anyone on any cameras. I look down for a couple seconds and back up. I see a little girl at the counter. She's so short I can only see just her nose up. Her eyes were solid black and she had black hair. She came out of nowhere and managed to make no noise at all. She was just staring at me silently. I was so scared at this point. I stuttered, "Hi, can I help you?" And she practically whispers in a monotone voice that didn't suit her, "Can I have some towels?" And I said, "Okay." And I'm practically doubling over with fear. I go around the corner to grab some towels and turn to see she's in the entryway to behind the counter. I was so scared. I could see her full body at this point, and she was exactly the kind of little girl you would expect in a horror movie. Waist-length black hair, pale complexion, black eyes, and barely audible. I handed her the towels and she grabbed them. Her hand touched mine as she did, and it was super clammy. In the same voice as before she says, "Thank you," and turns and walks away. I looked at the cameras and didn't see anyone go into any rooms or see her anywhere. I remained terrified all night and still have no explanation for this. I usually do not scare easily and love kids, but that night I felt a brand new kind of fear. This story took place somewhere around March to early April of 1958 on my grandparents' farm in East Peoria, Illinois. My great-grandfather had just passed away, so my grandmother, who was pregnant at the time with my mother, went to stay at my great-grandmother's house to comfort her through her time of mourning. That house is also located on a farm down the road a piece. My grandfather was home alone in the library room of my grandparents' house. The library room where my grandfather was at during the incident was on the left side of the house, and the doorway from the study went to the right of the house and into the dining room. My granddad heard some crying coming from the dining room, so he got up from his studies and went to the door to the study to investigate. He heard a woman, who he thought was my grandmother at first, crying and saying, "They wouldn't let me in. They wouldn't let me in." My grandfather thought to himself, "Well, that's strange. Who wouldn't let you in? Why wouldn't your mother let you into the house?" The woman had her hands covering her face, and had dark hair that came down to her shoulders. She walked in front of the staircase, and then in front of the study door, past my grandfather, into the front living room, and headed toward the north wall of the living room. My grandpa followed her into the living room. Just as she went, right through the wall. My grandfather was lost and trying to make sense of it all. It just happened. He knew as sure as day he had seen this woman walk through the wall. He realized that the woman wasn't my grandmother. The woman wasn't even from the same time period. She was wearing old-fashioned clothing. And come to think of it, the room had been different during this experience, as if it was from a different time as well. And my grandfather remembered hearing voices from another room at the same time of all this. The voices were saying things like, "What are we going to do with her?" My grandfather told no one of the incident for many years, because he didn't want folks to think he was crazy. He tried to do some research on the property, but found nothing. My great-grandfather on my mother's side, and his family, built the house in the early 1900s on the foundation of an older cabin-style house. Someone showed my grandpa a picture of the house that was there in the 1800s, and it had a door facing north, right where the woman walked through the wall. My grandfather heard the woman and experienced the whole scene over again a couple of years later when my grandmother was pregnant with my aunt. But this time it was more distant, more faded out, and my grandfather was upstairs in his bedroom. He said he didn't even bother to go see the woman that time. Once was enough for him. My grandpa somehow had a strong feeling and believed that the young woman had become pregnant outside of wedlock, and the family threw her out into the cold to fend for herself. He thought maybe she froze to death. In the 1800s, one who had a baby outside of a marriage wasn't always welcome with open arms and was seen as a disgrace, even shunned at times. It is really sad if that's what happened to that poor woman. This happened when I was a young kid around 14 years old. When I was young, times got rough and we had to move from our house I grew up in to another part of the state because my parents got a good job there, but in the new house at night you would hear footsteps on the roof, but we had no attic and at random spots in the house at night. Dishes would be moved, the table chairs would be flipped upside down, pictures knocked off the wall, and you always had the feeling you was being watched. If you had your door shut at night, you had the chance of it being opened and slammed shut again, several times. My parents thought it was me doing a prank because of what was happening in the kitchen at night, but it happened to their closet doors. When they checked it out, no one was there. We never saw anything, but it left clues like I explained behind, so you knew something was off. Other things tampered with included things like a TV being unplugged to handprints on clean surfaces. The last night I stayed in that house was when everything went to hell around 2 a.m. at night. The gas stove turned on, every single light switched flipped on in the house, random windows opened, doors opened and slammed, everything in the kitchen got tossed around like nothing, our fire tank exploded making the carpet wet, there were wet footprints on the tiles on the kitchen. I still remember seeing the fear in my father's eyes. He was never scared of anything, but he screamed at my mom and me to get out several times while I was asking what is going on. He just kept saying, "Get out, get out, get out." We got out of the house through the front door, and it actually opened and slammed on us, shattering into 1,000 pieces. My dad got the spare key from the bottom of his truck and we drove away without saying a word. We ended up stopping in town near a random fast food restaurant, shaking from the combination of shock and that it was around 60th outside and we were still in shorts. We had contact with a preacher because of our situation of this haunting, and we called him around 3 a.m. that night for guidance. He was nice enough to let us sleep in his living room, and I never felt safer sleeping outside of that hellhole of a house. We drove back around 9 in the morning to see if anything was basically salvageable from the house, and the police was there thinking someone ransacked the house. The cop said he heard laughing coming from inside when we were not there, so he had to go in and investigate, but found no one. The poor house was a mess, everything basically ruined except our clothing. The cops wanted my father to make a report, but he explained to them that they would not believe him. The scary part is that our beds were basically flipped over and tossed across the room, every picture off the wall, and every single fuse was tripped. We only took our clothes and stayed with my mom's mom for a few weeks until we found another place to stay at a few years later. Through casual conversation, I finally asked my father what he saw that night we left. He explained it as a figure in the darkness. He was darker than the dark, so he stood out, about 7 feet high with red eyes, horns, long claws, and legs like a goat. He explained this thing was staring at him from across the room. I am so traumatized I have not been down the same street that house was on for nearly 10 years, and never plan to. I will never forget that night. My great-granddad lived at a very remote village in Pakistan, where they had no electricity, no TV, no proper schools, so really no exposure to the outside culture. This happened when my great-granddad was relatively young in late 1930s. His routine involved waking up really early in the morning before sunrise to go to the fields early enough, as most people in the village back then could only travel either by walking or on a camel. So this one morning, he woke up and after breakfast left the house while it was still dark. Since there were no street lights back then, he only had a lantern for light. which he held in one hand and walked looking down to avoid stepping on a snake, etc. The village is in a desert, so finding snakes is quite common. Because it was quite early, the streets were completely deserted. Anyway, he had barely made it to the middle of the street when he heard the sound of bells ahead of him. It made him lift his lantern a bit higher and look up. According to him, as his eyes traveled up from the ground, he noticed a pair of feet wearing bright orange and red striped shoes with curved toes and bells on the ends. He continued looking up and saw a pair of legs, a torso, arms, and a head, covered from head to toe in the same orange and red striped outfit with ruffles around the neck and sleeves. My great-granddad noticed that on the head, this being was wearing a hat that had 3 pointy ends, with bells on each end, but there was no face, just a black mask where the face should begin. As soon as my great-granddad looked at this thing's face, it disappeared right in front of him. He ran back home and was freaked out for days after that. Now I need to remind everyone again that my great-granddad had never even heard of what a clown looked like. His description was so accurate that I instantly asked, "Did it look like a clown?" And he said, "I don't know what a clown is or looks like." It might sound strange to some people, but the village my great-granddad lived in is still way behind the times. The concept of Joker or clowns at a circus or birthday parties is still pretty much foreign to them. I know that a lot of people have a phobia of clowns. A lot of the times, we try to explain the fear saying things like, "It's because you can't see what's under the makeup," or "Some clowns have a sinister look about them." But for someone who has never even heard of a clown, seeing one in so much detail is incredible. And I'm kinda starting to believe that maybe the fear of clowns isn't just because they look weird. Maybe it's because the concept of clowns, they come from something paranormal. It would be interesting to see what other people think, and if any of you had any creepy incidences with a clown. When I was 2 years old, my family bought a very old house in Esparto, California. Our family was an extended one, with my grandparents living with us and taking care of me, while my father worked and my mother attended cosmetology school. We moved into the house in spring, and it wasn't long before strange things started to happen. The first incident occurred when my grandma was in the kitchen cooking dinner. My grandfather and I were sitting in a different room at the dinner table when she came flying out of the kitchen looking very scared and said there was something in there. My grandpa got up and went in to see what had scared her. He found nothing. However, she swore a dark presence, known as a shadow person these days, had manifested itself in the corner by the window. She said it felt very unwelcoming and dark. Shaken, but not wanting to be, she went back to finish dinner and wouldn't talk about it. She was a very no-nonsense person. It was strange to see her not okay, and a bit apprehensive about that area of the house after that experience. As spring turned to summer, the old house began to wake up. The sound of doors opening and closing, with footsteps going up and down the stairs, pacing the hallway, becoming a common occurrence. It always originated from the front door, which we rarely used as the parking was out back next to the back door. My grandparents and parents tried to downplay these things, telling me there was nothing to be afraid of, and that sometimes spirits remain in places. But I could tell they were learning to deal with it too. Time passed, and I grew, but the house still had that strangeness to it, usually peaking in late summer, early fall, then a quiet time during winter. Shadow people and crashing noises with no reason became normal. Scary, but normal. And a basement with an area of concrete dug up and replaced didn't help the creepiness of the house. My grandparents were very social folks and made new friends in the area. As time rolled on, we had visitors on a regular basis, and we greeted them with open arms and food and drinks. It was our custom to spend time in the front living room with the guests. One such visit started totally normal, just people stopping by to visit. Everyone was seated, talking. When I was asked to turn off the TV, I looked over and the TV was off, so I was a bit confused. But it was then that I noticed there was a sound of whistling in the general area of the TV. As I sat and stared at that area, I was told again, "Turn off the TV. It's rude when we have guests. To which I replied, "It's not on and never was." The guests and my family became silent. We stayed still and quiet, listening to the most beautiful tune being whistled from the corner of the room. It was a pure and heart-aching tune that I had never heard before. Our guests sat quietly for a few more minutes until the sound stopped. And then they suddenly and quickly began to get ready to leave. They did leave, and even though they still visited, they refused to ever come inside again. Then the year I turned 6, things really started getting active. At night we would hear slamming doors and crashing around the house that sounded like a fight. We all were awakened several times with what sounded like books and boxes being tossed around in the upstairs bedroom. Yet when we went up to the room to investigate, there would be nothing going on in the room except the sounds, which would continue on all around us, and then just quickly stop. During that time, more and more I was seeing dark shapes in the open closet in my bedroom. I should mention that the old house didn't really have closets. It had areas in the room set up to hang clothes like an open armoire. I was freaked out by now, but my family kept trying to calm and dismiss all the activity, always telling me it can't hurt you and don't be afraid. Midsummer. I was waking up late, as I liked to sleep in, and I heard a rustling sound from my closet. I looked over, just in time to see a man in old farm-style clothing parting the clothes and stepping into the room. Needless to say, I lost my cool, covered my head with my blankets, and began to scream. It was the weekend, so my entire family burst into the room. I screamed to them, "There's a man in the closet." Dad and Grandpa tore into the closet, but nothing was there. They showed me that no one was in my room and assured me no one could get into the closet. Then I knew what I saw, and I told them in great detail what he looked like and what he was wearing. Grandma and my mom took me downstairs and comforted me, telling me that the house and the ghost could not hurt me, and that they believed me. I was relieved a little bit, but after that I was shaken, and I had problems sleeping alone for months. Late summer that year, my mother was killed by a DUI driver. It was a horrible time for all of us, and the house too. The activity increased to almost daily occurrences, just the little things, noises and small items being misplaced. But the feel of the house changed as well. We buried my mom and tried to get on with our lives as best as anyone could. 4 months after the funeral, my dad, Grandma, and I went to Sacramento to shop. It was a good hour trip each way, and we had several stops to make, so we were gone most of the day. Upon arriving back home, we were greeted with fire trucks and an ambulance. The house had caught fire with my grandfather asleep inside. The fire originated from the closet where I had seen the man step into my room. According to the insurance adjuster, he was unsure how that could have happened, but it was the point of origin for sure. In fact, they did a deeper investigation just to be sure arson was not the true cause. Several days after the fire, we settled in a rental. At dinner, the adults were discussing the fire. My grandpa said it was the strangest thing. I would lay down to nap, and I swear I could hear someone crying. It sounded like a child or a woman was crying right outside the front door. But when I would get up to go see who was going on, no one was there. I would step outside, and the crying would sound like it was just around the corner of the house. So I would follow it, and it would move like it was leading me. And I followed it around the house with it, always being just around the next corner. I never found anything, and after a trip around the house, it would stop. But then it would come back inside, and it would start all over again. I must have walked around that house 10 times before I gave up on trying to nap in the living room. I went upstairs after that. He had fallen asleep when the little dog started barking and jumping on him. He woke up to smoke and flames coming from my room. He ran downstairs and tried to call for help, but even though the phone had a dial tone, he was unable to call out. He exited the house and ran to the neighbor's house, who called the fire department. The house burned beyond repair. We ended up tearing the remains of it down, filling in the basement with dirt, and rebuilding on a different section of the property. While some of the lumber from the old house was salvaged, we were advised not to use any of it in the new house, and we didn't, as none of us wanted to continue with the haunting we had been living through. I used to live in Quebec in an apartment with my parents. We used to live on the very bottom floor, almost like a basement. When you look outside the window, you could see grass. It was that low. I never ever had any paranormal experience in the apartment, therefore the sudden experience had shocked me to the core. A Friday night, my cousin decided to have a sleepover at my house. She and I had a great time and everything was going absolutely well. Until she decided to tell a scary story. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary since she usually did that. She was telling me a tale about someone getting their heads cut off. I don't quite remember her story in detail because it was 8 years ago, but it freaked the heck out of me. We soon finished with the scary stories and went to bed. We were in bed just talking to lighten the mood. Usually, at that time, random people would come out mostly to smoke and we would know because we could see the silhouettes of people's feet walking around on the grass when we looked out the window. It was getting really late, about 3 to 4 a.m. We could no longer see any silhouettes cause mostly everyone would be sound asleep in their homes by that time. My cousin and I were about to sleep until all of a sudden I started getting chills and I told my cousin about it. To my shock, he too was having chills and the same sensations as me. We looked out the window and saw a literal head going back and forth right outside our window. We were on the very basement floor. Either it's a person inside the ground poking its head out, but there was no way. We were covered in sweats and scared out of our senses. I tried to pull the curtains to see if that truly was a floating head, but my hands were shaky and I had a bad feeling about it, so I ended up not doing it. For hours the head kept going from one side to another. My cousin and I prayed and tried to sleep. I started to hear this sound that was almost like tiny bells. I told my cousin and she said she couldn't hear it. I had enough of it, so I went to sleep with my parents and my cousin came too. I have moved from Quebec to Ontario now and nothing has ever happened since. My sister married young at 18 and worked 2 jobs to support herself, her lousy husband and my niece Susie. She left the house at 8 a.m. and returned at 8 p.m. She kicked the louse out when she discovered he locked Susie in a closet with a box of cereal and a diaper and left her there all day. We didn't know this was happening. But that's around the time when this saga came. Susie's imaginary friend. She talked about her and to her all the time. We asked her many times if she meant Jessica, and she would get mad and say no. She said her name is Disaga. There are many stories of Susie and Disaga talking in plane, some creepier than others, and soon my sister forbid Susie to talk about Disaga or for us to talk to Susie about Disaga. Susie revealed the closet secret when she told her mom, Disaga is mad at you because you don't believe she is real. She comes to play with me when Daddy closes the closet door after you leave and lets us out before you come home. Creepy, right? Poor kid. Conjured up an imaginary playmate for the year her dad was supposed to be watching her. Now comes the super creepy part. My sister is now divorced. Susie is not allowed to talk about Disaga. It's been a while since her dad has lived with them and they are moving out of the house they rented. The sweet old landlord is there to oversee the move out and he says, I was always worried about your little girl on those basement stairs. My little granddaughter Jessica fell down those basement stairs and broke her neck and died in front of that closet door down there. My sister said she got the chills and simply said, Disaga, and the old man looked at her and asked, how did you know that's how she said her name? She was 4 and couldn't say it properly. How did you know? Sadly, my sister is very good at denial and told him she didn't know what he was talking about, took the last of her things from the house, and left. Fast forward 20 years, and we are still not allowed to talk about Susie and her friend this saga. She has also never been informed of the abuse of what happened to her when she was 5, and we had strict orders to never discuss it with her. This happened about 25 years ago, but I still think about it on a regular basis. At the time, my 2 boys were around 6 and 8 years old and happened in a small town about 20 miles from Skinwalker Ranch in the Uinta Basin, Utah. Having grown up there, I had more than a few personal experiences that still give me chills, but this event was beyond anything I've experienced before or even heard about. My 2 boys slept in a bunk bed in a room just across the hall from my room. I was fast asleep when I was suddenly woken up by the most intense and terrifying screams from my boys, screaming and crying out for me. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my pistol from the top of my dresser, and threw open my door. How do I say this? There in front of me, running out of my son's bedroom, was a 2 to 3 foot bright green creature. I have no idea what it was, but it looked at me as it exited their room and shot down the hallway, made a quick turn and shot down my basement stairs. Keep in mind, all of the lights were off, but this thing stood out, bright green in color with black patches on its face and body. I only got a quick look at it, but what my kids would tell me terrified me. I ran into their room and flipped on the light. There they were, both of them standing in the middle of the room holding their pillows. They were crying and screaming so hard I couldn't understand what they were saying. My wife came in and began to calm them down while I went looking for whatever just ran down to my basement. I searched everywhere, every corner, but found nothing. I went back upstairs and asked my boys what happened. Without going into great detail here, what they told me was horrifying. My youngest son told me he woke up and noticed something green, hunched over, standing in the doorway, just looking at him. He wasn't sure what it was, so he sat up, and when he did, this thing started grinning at him with big teeth, causing him to let out a scream, waking up my older son. While my younger son was telling me what he had seen, my older son spoke up and said it looked like Darth Maul, but green. If this sounds familiar, Darth Maul is a Star Wars character. Look him up and you will get an idea as to what this thing looked like. Imagine a short, hunched-over Darth Maul. Now, I guess out of fear, my youngest son grabbed his pillow and started hitting this thing, which had now moved into the room, closer to them. He then tells me it grabbed hold of his pillow and started growling at him. This caused my older son to start screaming as well, and within seconds he joined in with his pillow, hitting it over and over, until it suddenly let go of the pillow, turned, and started back towards the bedroom door. I think it must have heard me open my door, because this is about when I saw it. Like I said, I didn't get the best look at it, but it was bright green with black patches, and it moved extremely fast. This event had a profound impact on my youngest son. From this point forward, he would only sleep with his head covered, which always worried me. I had to sleep in their room for the next week or 2 before they would go to sleep without me, and only with a lamp on in the room. I had an experience with something very similar when I was about 8 years old, and I sometimes wondered if it was the same thing. What I can tell you is that this is a real, 100% true event, and the first time I've shared it with anyone outside of my family. I don't expect anyone to believe it, but I'm telling you it's all true. Let me start off with a little backstory. I had a step-grandpa. His name was Evan. He was paralyzed on the whole right half of his body and brain from a stroke back when I was a small child. My stepdad Edward and the rest of my family always took care of Evan, so we gave him a bell, and he didn't have a bedroom door for safety reasons. I had just turned 16 years old about a week before this happened. 2 days after my birthday, Evan passed away once he signed the house over to the bank. This was the house he grew up in, and Edward was raised in. This house was supposed to go to Edward after Evan's passing. I wish I could say that the figure I saw was Evan. I would give anything for it to have been Evan instead. The house was empty, and my parents were in their rooms finishing up with packing their last couple of boxes. I was sitting outside when the police showed up. They asked to speak with my parents, so I ran to get them. After knocking on their door, letting them know the police were on the front step wanting to speak with them, I turned to look down the hallway into the doorway of Evan's old room. At first, I smiled and said, "I see you, Grandpa." And he was always so happy when I called him that. He knew I could see spirits sometimes, so I thought that's why he was there. I started walking towards him and asked if he had found peace. That's when I realized it wasn't Evan. My heart started racing. It became hard to breathe. I couldn't control the fact that I was still walking towards this thing. It was a black, shadowy man who was tall and buff with a large top hat on top of his head. His hands looked like claws as he pointed at me. I tried so hard not to move and I screamed for help. That's when my stepdad flung open his bedroom door and looked down the hallway to see the same figure I did. At the same time, the police officer heard me scream for help and ran in with his gun drawn and pointed it at the shadowy figure. The officer couldn't believe his eyes. He stepped back, and so did my stepdad. That's when I screamed, "You can't have me. Leave me alone. Go away." And at that moment, I felt myself able to stop moving towards it, but it still had left. At that moment, I said, "I am stronger than you will ever be. You can't take me." And the officer yelled for us to get down on the ground, so we did just that. However, the dark figure faded away, and the officer turned the corner and asked us what that was. I told him I believed it to be a demon. He laughed at me and asked us not to pull pranks, and said someone could have seriously gotten hurt. I said it wasn't a prank, and after that, we all went to the front yard and calmed down. This friend and a few of his college buddies loved going on a ghost hunt, and had heard about some graveyard where children murdered by their mother had been buried. The graveyard was located off the main road, so my friend parked his car on the side of the road, and the group got out and followed the small path through the woods for a couple minutes to get to the graveyard. Once there, nothing exciting happened for the first 10 minutes or so, and they had tried everything the website or wherever they heard the story told them to do, with nothing resulting. They got bored, and being typical, inebriated college kids, started taunting the supposed ghost of the mother. This continued for a few minutes before they tired and decided to go back to the car as one of the girls had to go to the bathroom. Once they got back to the car, my friend, the sober driver, tried opening the handle without unlocking the car because he hadn't locked it in the first place, but found it locked. He attributed this to bad memory at the time. The group drove home, laughing and talking like normal. After he had dropped all the others off at their homes, he went back to his own house. He got in at the same time as one of his roommates, who stopped and waited for them to pull in. The roommate had his phone out and shined the light in the window when his friend pulled in as a joke. What he saw was tiny, baby-sized handprints all over the windows. As soon as my friend got out, he went into the house without saying a word to the roommate. The roommate, confused, went back to the car and tried to rub one of the handprints. They were on the inside of the window. To this day, my friend will not speak of his drive home after he dropped off his other friends, and has since sold the car without ever driving it again. My apartment's about 85 years old, and situated in a very quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of New York City. The building is so quiet that it's sometimes eerie. It actually resembles an old haunted castle with its stonework, arches, courtyard, as well as several wrought iron Juliet windows. In fact, every Halloween, the building is like a magnet for trick-or-treaters because it's so atmospheric. The building's history is unknown to me. I only know that it's situated on a very old road that goes back to the 1800s when it was farmland. I've been primarily living here alone and have no children or pets. Also, I'm a bit of a neat freak, so there's no chance of people, rodents, or falling clutter playing any role of these spooky occurrences. I used to be a little skeptical regarding the effects of the paranormal on anything battery-operated, but when I recently purchased a battery-operated motion sensor light, I reconsidered. This small rectangular light from a reputable company worked very well and was helpful at night so I didn't have to fumble in the dark in the kitchen. My kitchen and living room are linked together in an open floor plan. Also, the motion sensor was on a counter facing away from the living room toward the wall. Anyway, one night, I had all the apartment lights out except for a dim light in the living room where I was watching TV. I was sitting quietly, far away from the motion sensor. All of a sudden, the motion sensor light turned on, then off, then on, continuously. I watched wide-eyed for a few minutes. I gingerly got up and walked toward the flashing light. It couldn't have been a battery issue, those were freshly changed. After a few experiments, I concluded the light was working as it should be. So I put it back on the kitchen counter and stepped far away. Lo and behold, the light started turning on and off, on and off. I removed the batteries and put it away. Another recent experience involved an old photo. My mom had placed a magnetized childhood photo of me on the side of the brand new refrigerator. There was also a little resin hummingbird magnet next to it. This is not an area where it can brush against at all. About several weeks after they dropped off the magnet, I walked by and noticed that my photo was turned all the way to the right. This to me was the creepiest occurrence of all. A few days after that, the hummingbird magnet crashed to the floor on its own, breaking off a piece of its wing. In defiance, I placed the photo of the now glued together hummingbird back on the refrigerator, and absolutely nothing has happened since. One more experience involved a bathroom mirror. It was a brand new magnified makeup mirror with a powerful suction cup and strong locking mechanism. I locked it carefully to the bathroom mirror, which had just been polished. It was never handled again. All was well for quite some time until one night there was a crash in the bathroom. I ran in and found the secured makeup mirror had actually dislodged and was resting in the sink. It was unfathomable. I had made certain the lock could not be budged. I reattached the mirror and pulled hard on it. It stayed firmly and locked in place. There have been a bizarre pattern of these small, creepy disruptions that have never made sense. It seems that this particular area of my apartment has been a weird paranormal hotspot since day one. I should add, when I first moved in, I found a very dark, rather sticky spot about a foot wide, soaked into the wooden floor underneath the rug. This is the very area where most of these spooky events have been occurring. I have recently become aware that I may be a sensitive and ghosts have been following me since I was a child. I was raised in a heavily religious household, so much so that the belief of paranormal, or anything remotely pagan, was very much frowned upon. However, I have always known that there had to be something else out there up until the age of 6 or 7. My parents kept a baby monitor in my room simply because they were always overbearing and overprotective. My dad recently told me that every night he would wake up to my voice over the baby monitor at 3 a.m. having full-on conversations with no one. It got so bad that one time, he even ran to my room thinking there must have been an intruder, but found my room empty and me fast asleep. After that incident, he figured I was just waking up to go to the bathroom and talking to an imaginary friend, or talking in my sleep. My own memories get a bit weirder than that, unfortunately. I remember specifically lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, watching shapes and figures form in the darkness before my eyes. This still happens to this day. I see little wisps of blue mist in every room, no matter how dark before bed. The wisps move and form into orbs and sometimes crude faces with unrecognizable features to them. I remember crying at night as a child because of them. Not from fear, but from heartache because they looked sad. I would like to point out here that until the age of 11 I had never had any frightening experiences. I believe that the talking my dad heard when I was young was likely me talking to the blue wisps, asking why they were so sad. I remember some of them would look happier after talking to me that night and I would not see them again. Yet the ones who still looked sad would return the next night, and the next until they too became happy. I also used to have dreams of people that I had never seen before. Yes, I know your brain can't create faces of people you've never met, but I mean before I even saw a picture of my grandfather, who died in my mother's 20s. I had seen his face. The very first time I saw his picture, my mother said that I happily exclaimed, "That's Depp. He plays with me in my dreams." My mother's maiden name is Duckworth. All of the grandchildren called her father Papa Depp. My mother, a very religious woman, assumed that this was Papa Duck checking on his last little duckling that he didn't get to meet before he passed. The event that stands out most in my memory when I think about the things that happened when I was young was the entity that helped me save my grandmother's life. I was woken up by a voice that called my name and told me my grandmother was sick and needed my help, that I needed to go get my mother because this was an emergency. My mother and I ran into each other in the kitchen that night. Something had woken her up by tapping her on the forehead. She assumed it was me, but when she opened her eyes no one was there. My grandmother was staying with us while she was recovering from surgery on her shoulder. When we came into her room, she had chills so violent my mother thought she was seizing. Her immune system was weakened by the surgery, and she had caught a severe case of the flu and had developed pneumonia while she was in the hospital. She had to be rushed to the emergency room, where we were informed that if we were an hour later, she may not have been with us. As a kid, I used to hear voices as well, odd whispers from people who I didn't recognize. I would hear my name being called when no one was around. I would hear people advising me what I should and shouldn't do, guiding me, like that little voice in your head that people call their instinct or their gut. Except mine wasn't just my inner monologue. My parents thought I just had imaginary friends, or I was making up wild stories. Anytime I told them about it, around the time I turned 11, things turned sinister. This is likely because I witnessed my best friend's suicide over Skype chat that same year, and I was diagnosed with severe clinical depression. The blue wisps came less often in that time of my life, and were replaced with looming figures darker than black. Yes, you got that right. These things were so dark that they weren't just black, they were something worse. The only way I can describe it is that dark sinking feeling you get if you've ever had a near-death experience, where you know that there is no hope for you, that you're a goner and you're about to die right then and there. These figures were accompanied by the onset of my very first experience with sleep paralysis. But certainly not my last. My first experience of sleep paralysis is decently cliche. Dark looming figure at the end of my bed, inability to move, heavy feeling in my chest. You've all heard the stories, but something else happened that I really don't hear in many sleep paralysis stories that I've come across. I heard these awful sounds that didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. They were warped and guttural. They instilled a fear so deep into my bones that I am having difficulty even writing about them now. I would compare it to the sound that many people hear from skinwalkers. The sound of an unknown creature being brutally torn apart, screaming for its life. The sound of murder. The figure would stare at me, while these screams continued, and every time I blinked or closed my eyes it would get a little closer until all I would see was that darkness I mentioned earlier. Complete darkness. Darker than black, no hope, the feeling of being a goner. Then it would just stop. Everything would return to normal and I'd be left lying in my bed hyperventilating and sobbing. Incidents like these happened just about every night from the time I was 11 to the time that I was a junior in high school. Junior year, these sleep paralysis episodes started to die down, probably because I was put on high doses of depression medication and getting my depression under control. Spirits and entities tend to take advantage of you in your most vulnerable states, like when you're sick or suicidal. These are the times when your positive vibrations are at their lowest points and your consciousness is not well protected. I still have these episodes every once in a while, right before something bad happens. I experienced one in October, the day before I got the news that a dear friend from high school had taken her own life. And I had an episode the day before my grandmother passed away. I only experienced them before times of great tragedy in my life. I was about 6 years old when these experiences happened. When I was young, my parents had divorced, causing our family to abruptly split up and move into different homes. My dad moved my brother and I to a new apartment owned by my father's best friend. It was a nice apartment, half a house, that had many rooms and a lot of space for my brother and I to play in. Money was tight, but my dad did what he could to provide for his kids. The house seemed normal at first, but it all seemed to quickly change. My first experience began soon after we moved in. I had lost a tooth at school and was excited to leave it for the tooth fairy. That night, my dad helped me do my usual night routine of showering, brushing my teeth, and changing into my pajamas. My dad tucked me in and told me good night, and I fell asleep quickly. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise and a general feeling of anxiety. Expecting to wake up to the tooth fairy, I woke up to a shadow person standing over the top of me, inches from my face, staring into my eyes. The shadow was the darkest thing I have ever seen. It had no eyes, just empty sockets full of nothing. I couldn't scream, I couldn't cry. I sat motionless, staring into the black hole of eyes for what seemed like minutes. It tilted its head in a very unnatural motion before running into the wall and disappearing. I screamed for my dad. He busted through the closed door. I told him what had happened, but there was nothing he could do except comfort me. He reassured me that it was just a dream, and that it couldn't hurt me. But I couldn't sleep after that. A few weeks later, I was taking a bath before bed. My dad always kept the door open to make sure I was safe in the bathtub. Sitting in the bathtub, you could see the bottom of the stairs. I stopped playing with my toys and looked at the bottom of the stairs. Something caught my eye. I glanced at the bottom of the stairs again, and saw the same figure that I had seen just a few weeks earlier. Frightened and confused, I tried to call my dad. Before I could even get out a word, a figure ran up the stairs with impossible speeds and was at the door to the bathroom, staring at me. It was a humanoid figure, dark as night, contorting its body into unnatural positions. That's when I screamed as loud as I ever have, which sent my dad into full panic. He ran so fast up those stairs and pulled me out of the tub, thinking I was hurt. As before, there was nothing. All they could do was comfort me. I cried for hours in pure, genuine terror. A few weeks later, my brother started to experience weird and terrifying occurrences. He would be fast asleep in the middle of the night, when the stereo in his room would turn on maximum volume, blasting his death metal music. It would wake everybody up in the house, of course. My dad would bust into his room angry that he was being woken up by my brother's nonsense. My brother would explain that he wasn't the one turning on the music, and he was just as shocked as everyone else. That happened a few times. One night, my brother and I were staying at Mom's for the weekend. The stereo in my brother's room turned on full blast in the middle of the night. My dad, being home alone when it happened, finally realized that it wasn't my brother doing it. The final straw came when my dad was home alone cleaning. He was walking down the hallway when he saw the black shadow figure in the middle of the day. He was on one side of the hallway, and the thing was on the other end of the hallway, staring menacingly at my dad. But before my dad could blink, the thing ran down the hallway at an unnatural speed and right through my dad's body. Horrified at what just happened to him, he promptly left the house and didn't go back until the next day. We moved out of that house shortly afterward. My dad spoke with his best friend, telling him what had been happening. My dad's friend told him that an old woman had passed away in the house prior to us moving in. Being a logical person, my dad didn't think anything of it. My dad's friend had a few experiences in the house when he was working in the attic. One time he was shoved from behind while he was renovating the attic. He was scared and left the house for a little bit. When he came back to finish working on the attic, he attempted to leave, and the attic door was mysteriously locked, and he couldn't get out. He was stuck in the attic with that thing. He had to call someone to get out of the attic. In that house, doors would arbitrarily lock themselves, including the attic and basement. Footsteps could be heard, and doors would slam shut all the time. After finding out, my dad told me the woman who passed away in the house was a harmless spirit, and that I had nothing to worry about. All I can say is that she was far from harmless and loved terrifying my family. I have driven past that house in recent years, but I still can't bring myself to go inside. I'm 68 years old. I've been an addict most of my adult life. When I look back and try to psychoanalyze myself as to why I continue to live this way, my thoughts always go back to a time in my life when my siblings, cousins, and I started playing with a Ouija board. None of us were over 13 years old at the time, and I can't remember for the life of me where the board came from. The first time we played, there were 4 of us touching the planchette. The only question I remember us asking is if they were dead. The planchette slowly moved to yes. I know I wasn't moving it, and from the look of fear on my sisters' and cousins' faces I could tell they weren't moving it either. It freaked us out so much we just let go, and as far as I know, no one ever touched it again. We didn't know about closing the door, and the board was just placed in a closet, and was probably thrown out at some point. I don't really know. A couple of nights later, we tried to levitate a table. I don't know if people still do this, and I can't remember the spell, as this was over 50 years ago. All I remember is that we all placed our fingertips on top of a heavy dinner table and said something. The table started rising, and when it got about 2 feet from the floor, we all freaked out again and ran away. The table dropped hard on the floor. That was the last time we dabbled in the occult. But I think the occult wasn't done with us. It didn't affect everyone. Just me and my cousin Jimmy. Life changed for both of us. I'm not proud of what follows, but I can't explain how bizarre life became without telling everything. At 12 years old, we started breaking into houses. We started drinking and doing drugs. Our circle of friends changed drastically. and we both got involved with witchcraft. Nothing like this had even crossed my mind before the paranormal experience. Jimmy was sent to juvenile detention until he was old enough to go to prison for kidnapping and attempted murder. We didn't come from broken homes or bad environments. Jimmy was a gifted athlete and could have gotten a full football scholarship to go to college, but instead he went to prison. We both knew what we were doing was wrong. We talked about it, we just couldn't stop the bad behavior. I said all that to say this. I learned about spirit possession a couple of years ago. I met a shaman who helped me realize how real spirit possession is. He said I checked all the boxes before I even told him about not closing the Ouija board. He moved out west before we started the cleansing ritual. He sent me a piece of pyrite to keep in my pocket, and a blessing to say before I carried it. It actually helped at first. I'm not sure if it was the mineral or a placebo effect. A story from Paterson, New Jersey. Pietro and Carmela Pagnivo were brothers who moved to the U.S. from Italy. The two had a long-standing feud that began from a dispute regarding the sharing of property after their parents died in Italy. During their lives in New Jersey, they became bitter enemies, and each brother built up a lot of influence and became leaders of rival segments within the Italian population in the area where they lived, known then as White Alley. The Italian families that lived in the area agreed not to talk to the police, so they had a hard time getting the facts, and they also gave news sources wrong information, including changing of first and last names. And some said Carmela attacked his father with a knife, that Pietro came to their father's defense, but their father had actually died in Italy before this took place. On Easter Sunday, April 7th, 1901, Pietro and his wife had people over to play cards while celebrating Easter at their apartment on Brook Avenue in Paterson, New Jersey. Their brother Carmela came by and tried to enter through the front door, but his entry was refused. Carmela left, but he swore to get vengeance. It wasn't long before Carmela returned. He smashed a window and crawled through, and rushed at his brother Pietro with a pistol in his hand. The guests fled the apartment, and the two brothers were left alone to battle. Pietro knew his brother was intending on murdering him, so he grabbed an axe to defend himself. Carmela began firing his pistol with poor aim, and Pietro swung and hit Carmela across the head with the axe, knocking him to the floor. Carmela half rose up and continued firing his pistol. Pietro was struck a couple of times, but one bullet struck him in the side and hit a vital organ. When the police arrived, the two were lying on the floor glaring at each other, but too weak to fight anymore. They were both rushed to the hospital, and both died not long afterward. Pietro was 36 and left behind a wife. He was buried at the Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Totowa, New Jersey. It was early July in the same year that Pietro had been murdered by his brother. Pietro's widow came screaming out of her unit and into one of the neighbors' homes. She was hysterical and yelling that she'd just seen her dead husband in her apartment. Then, 2 nights later at 9 p.m., every single faucet in the apartment complex was turned on and pouring out water, all at the same time. And that event was followed 2 days later by the exact same thing happening. All the faucets in the complex turned on in each unit at the same time. Soon the tenants began to freak out about the ghostly happenings, and they began to think that perhaps Mrs. Paganello had in fact seen her dead husband, and that Pietro Paganello had returned to haunt the building. It was impossible for a living person to turn on all the faucets at the same time like that. A few nights after the faucets turning on, 2 men who lived in the complex said they saw a ghostly form flitting about the hallways. They attempted to follow it, but lost trace. It didn't take too long after the haunting events began for several of the families to decide they didn't want to live in the haunted complex, so they moved out. And even after some of these tenants had moved out, the units were locked up and empty. The lights in some of those units would turn on at night. That was proof positive to all the tenants that the ghost of the murdered Pietro Paganello was haunting the apartment complex. Soon, all the remaining tenants found somewhere else to live and moved out in a hurry. The apartment complex was empty with "to rent" signs on every single door. Local Italians who heard the story claimed that Pietro wanted to wash away the blood spilled by his family, and that is why the faucets were turned on. Others said that Pietro had returned for revenge